Hi, Mrs. Olivo's class. My name is Ayana Smith, and I'm a musicologist at Indiana University. I got your questions, and I'm so excited to be able to speak with you today about what I do.
When and why did you become interested in musicology?
To start with, I took piano lessons, I sang in choir, I learned how to play the cello. I played cello in my school orchestra starting in 5th grade, just at your age. And I studied a lot of literature. When I was in college, I studied Latin, I studied Italian, I studied French, I studied German. And then in my 3rd year of college, I went on a study abroad program to Italy, and I studied classics in Rome. And while I was there, I took classes in ancient history, in the ancient city, and archaeology, all the old buildings, and studying when they were built and why and how, in art history and in Italian. And I got really fascinated with the relationship between Italian literature, Latin literature, and music. And I also went to an opera. I think that might have been the first time I went to a live opera production, and I just loved it. And because I had a background in music and had done so much singing, I became interested in studying opera. So that's how I became a musicologist. I applied to graduate school and got in to musicology programs and went to Yale, where I studied musicology. So that's how I ended up where I am today.
What do you think music teach and is it boring?
I bet you anything my daughter Elena put you up to that one, because she thinks what I do is boring. Hi, Elena. But I don't think it's boring at all. I think it's really interesting when you can start to understand why people made music the way they did, and you can start to understand how to perform it better when you have a better idea of where the music came from. And that's essentially what I do as a musicologist. Most of my students are here at Indiana to study music performance. And so what I try to do is I try to teach them new ways of understanding music so that their performances can be even more exciting. That's one of the things I do. So I teach all kinds of music. I teach music from the Baroque period. That's music from about the year 1580 to about 1750. Can you imagine what music was like back then? I also teach music about women composers, and that's really exciting to me because a lot of people think that there weren't any good women composers. And anyone who takes my class knows that there are a lot of really good and really interesting women composers. It's just that people don't know about it. So one of the things I love to do is to teach people about things that they didn't know about before and give them new ways of thinking about it. Another thing that I teach is opera. And some people think opera is boring, but that's because they don't really understand it. Opera is theater, and opera is about expressing emotions. And it's really exciting once you understand what the plots are about. And once you understand a little bit more about the musical background, then I think you can really enjoy it. Sometimes I also teach music of African American composers, and I teach music of the blues, which I think you know a little bit about. I hear that you studied some blues songs earlier this year. So that's a little bit more about what I do.
What's your favorite genre in music and why?
That is actually, for me, a really hard question, because I love music of all types, from the earliest creations of music that we have written down, which mostly is ancient Greek or like plain chant for the Roman Catholic Church, all the way up to music that was created yesterday. But there are some pieces of music that I guess I listen to more over and over again just because I enjoy them so much. I love opera. I love going to the opera, and I just love the drama of it, and I love the visual element of it. I love how it involves acting and singing and emotions, and it involves texts that are really interesting, and I just love the combination of all of those things together. But some of my other favorites are other kinds of vocal music, like vocal music that you sing in smaller spaces, maybe not even in a concert hall, but like in a small church setting or just with your friends. Like madrigals are pieces that you might sing with your friends if you had some friends that were good singers. And I love the blues because it expresses so many interesting things that people were experiencing in history. The kinds of difficulties that African Americans had in farm labor and in moving to cities to look for better employment in the 20s and 30s. And I like the way it expresses a kind of folk culture. The songs about the boll weevil or the songs about trains and things like that that were parts of everyday life. So opera and the blues are two very different kinds of music, but they both express basic human emotions that I think everybody can relate to, and the music is beautiful, even though it's very different kinds of music. And so those are some of my favorites, and maybe that gives you an indication of why. But I also love the symphony and the string quartet and the art song, and maybe that's why I'm a musicologist too, because there's so much music that I just love.
Who is the most interesting person you've interviewed?
People, especially who work on very modern music, might want to interview composers who are creating that music, and that is still considered musicology. Some of the most interesting people I've met through conferences, and really they're interesting because they all have different ways of thinking about music and different ways of expressing ideas about music, and I find that that's a really interesting part of my job. But another thing that I find really interesting, I don't interview my students, but I meet amazing people every day in my job here at IU. Last week, one of my students emailed me because she couldn't be in class, and do you know why she couldn't be in class? Because she had an agent. She's a singer, and she has a management company, and they called her and said, "Would you like to sing the soprano part in Beethoven's Ninth Symphony next week in Korea? And we're going to broadcast it all the way throughout Korea and Germany." And so some of the most interesting people I meet every day are actually people that just seem like everyday people in my class, but once you get to know them a little bit better, you find out that they're doing really fascinating and interesting projects outside the classroom and interacting with other musicians in really interesting ways. I had another student who decided he was an undergraduate, and he developed his own curriculum. He wrote his own reading assignment for them to read, and then he presented it to them in a really interesting way. And so sometimes it's the little things like that, the students in my classes that are doing things that I never would have known about except for the fact that they told me that they were doing these really interesting things. And so I meet interesting people every day in what I'm doing, even though I never have to really interview anyone for my job.
What genre of music do you work with?
Your last question to me was, what genre do I work with? I work in two different genres. Mostly I work in opera, and I work in Italian opera from a long time ago, from the 17th century, which is almost 400 years ago. But I also do some work in the blues, which is much more recent, but the blues that I work on is a little bit older. It's still from the 1920s and 1930s. So right now I'm writing a book that talks about how opera from the 17th century in Italy borrowed themes from literature and art. And one of these operas that I'm dealing with is written on the theme of the woman in the mirror, which is a very famous painting by Titian, and there's one by Bellini. These were the famous masters of Venetian art in the Renaissance period. So these operas were representing themes that people knew through pictures, through paintings that they saw in palaces in their own time. But they also were dealing with literature, And a lot of the operatic subjects from the time that I study are related to ancient Greek and Roman mythology. If any one of you is reading the Percy Jackson series of novels, you'll know a lot about the characters from ancient Greek and Roman mythology. So what I'm going to send to you is an excerpt from one of my favorite passages of Baroque opera. I'm going to send a link by email to Mrs. Olivo, and hopefully she can play just a little bit of it for you in class. This is from an opera that's about Jason, who went on a quest to capture the golden fleece with his Argonauts. And the scene that I'm sending to you shows how in the opera version of this tale, the sorceress Medea has to call up spirits from the underworld to try to help Jason with this quest of stealing, really, the golden fleece from her island. And this opera has a special theme that kind of represents the idea of Medea trying to break down the doors of hell and let the spirits out, these demons that are going to help her with magic and help Jason to win the golden fleece. And that special theme goes like this. Bum, 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 bum. Bum, 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 bum. Bum, 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 bum. So of course I'm singing this, but it's supposed to be instrumental parts, so you'll hear it in the orchestra. But each one of those notes that I'm saying bump for is really just a string bow in the instruments. Those of you who might be taking string classes know exactly what I mean when I say a string bow. These are all down bows, so they're very heavy and they sound very percussive. And I think for the 17th century audience, it really would have been a little bit scary to hear music performed like this. It's a very unusual kind of gesture. So maybe you can watch just a little bit of this, maybe 1 minute or so, and see what you think about Baroque opera from this time period. Baroque opera is from the 17th century. Do you like it? Is it fun? Is Medea a little bit scary as a witch? Do you think you would want to learn more about Baroque opera? And you can tell me what your thoughts are about what I do.